Okay, sorry for the wait, guys, but here is the final Truth About One Punch Man video, aka the final Egyptian mythology video. I'll link the playlist here because I've made many videos in this series, and of course I don't expect you guys to watch all of them if you haven't already, but it would really help with catching you up on what we're going to be talking about in this video. At least just watch this Saitama being Ra video. But I'll also try to quickly catch you up to speed on what's going on in these videos. So one, the creator of One Punch Man has based a large portion of the story off of the Osiris myth from ancient Egyptian mythology, as well as many characters in the series off of Egyptian gods. And the characters and gods that we're going to be talking about in this video are Saitama, who is based off of the sun god Ra, God, who is based off of Osiris, the god of the moon, Psychos, who is based off of Isis, the goddess of fertility, Drive Knight, who is based off of Horus, the god of the sky, and Fubuki, who is based off of Sekhmet, the goddess of healing. Now, I'm also going to be going into major spoilers for the webcomic, like talking about what's currently happening at that point, which is technically many arcs and years ahead of where the manga's continuity currently is. But aside from that, I'm also possibly going into spoilers for things that we're technically not supposed to know yet, like a major storyline, like twist that is going to happen at some point in the story, possibly. Because that being said, all of this isn't really concrete, of course. We're just talking, speculating, theorizing, trying to connect the dots on what may or may not happen. So just keep that in mind. I'm not telling you like this is guaranteed to happen, guys, but you know, we're kind of just having fun in this video. But I do really think that there's like a good chance that what we're going to be discussing in this video is going to happen, because it's seemingly already being built up in the story as we speak. And of course, I'll show you what I mean by supplying numerous examples, but that's enough for the caveats. Let's get into it. So the story that we're going to be talking about today is the secret name of Ra. So as we know by now, Ra is the god of the sun, and essentially like the strongest god that there was. And he also had many names and many forms. However, there was one name which had not been spoken since time began. And to know Ra's secret name was to have power over him and over the world that he had created. Now, on the other hand, Isis longed for such a power. She had dreamed that one day she would have a marvelous falcon-headed son called Horus, and she wanted the throne of Ra to give to her child. Now, there's multiple variations of this story, as well as with most of the ancient Egyptian mythology stories, but both of them always correlate to Isis giving Ra's power to Horus or Osiris. And I think that one is adapting a mixture of the both here, because as we said, Osiris is God, you know, the god from One Punch Man, and Horus is Drive Knight. But I'll get more into that later. Isis was the mistress of magic, wiser than millions of men, but she knew that nothing in creation was powerful enough to harm its creator, being Ra. And her only chance was to turn the power of Ra against himself. And at last, Isis thought of a cruel and cunning plan. So every day Ra walked through his kingdom, attended by a crowd of his spirits and lesser deities, but Ra was growing old and his eyes were dim, and he had even begun to drool. So one day, Isis essentially snuck up behind Ra and watched him as he walked, and she waited for his drool to land on the ground. And once it eventually did, she made sure that the coast was clear, and she scooped up Ra's saliva. And what she eventually did with this was mix it with earth and form it into a serpent. And the next day, when Ra came walking through his kingdom with his group of spirits and deities, she approached the crossroads, and her spell on the clay serpent began to work, and it came to life. And as Ra passed, it bit him on the ankle, and Ra gave a scream that was heard all throughout creation. This essentially just wrecked Ra. Like, this was the worst pain he had ever felt, and he was essentially powerless from the poison that it had given him. So it eventually got to the point of where all of the other gods came to Ra's aid and trying to figure out like what was wrong with him, you know, what's going on. But Isis was also there, and she was like, hey, you know, I could help you, Ra. You know, I could cure you of this poison, but you're gonna have to tell me your secret name. You know, the name that you've never said out loud before. And Ra, of course, tries to walk around this question, like not wanting to give her the true name, of course, because we found out that if he does, then you have power over Ra and all of creation, essentially. But Isis keeps going on. She's like, nah, the only way I can heal you is if you give me your name. And it eventually gets to the point of where the poison and the pain is just unbearable. And Ra's like, okay, I'll tell you. And he makes sure that all of the other gods, like, you know, move away. And he whispers into Isis's ear what his true name is. And after he says it, he's like, in time, you can give it to your son or husband, but warn them to never betray the secret. And Isis nodded and began to chant a great spell that drove the poison out of the limbs of Ra, and he rose up stronger than before. Isis then shouted for joy at success of her plan, because she knew that one day Horus, her son, or Osiris, her husband, would sit in the throne of Egypt and wield the power of Ra. So that's the story right there. So now let's break it down and correlate it to One Punch Man. So this posits that there's a possibility that at some point, Psychos is going to poison Saitama with like his own power, essentially, right? And it's like, how do we get to that point? Because things aren't really set up like that yet, right? So let me go over how I think that's going to happen. So Psychos is currently with Fubuki in the webcomic. Like, I guess they're at the Blizzard Group's base of operations or whatever. And Fubuki was like trying to get through to Psychos' mind to figure out, what's going on with her and for a lesser extent, God. Now, this means that Psychos is eventually going to escape from Fubuki, which I think a lot of us speculated is going to happen. But this seems to make it all but assured. And how is Psychos going to escape from Fubuki? And I think a good catalyst for that is what actually happened in the latest chapter of the webcomic, when it was revealed that imposter Metal Knight drones have like invaded the cities and are just destroying everything. Now I say imposter because in my opinion, these are refabricated Metal Knight drones that were made by Drive Knight and the organization in order to frame Metal Knight. Talked about this before. Check out my Truth About Genos and Drive Knight video. But I assume that that could possibly get to the attention of Fubuki, or maybe they're even like attacking the area that she's in, and this will allow Psychos to escape. Now, after that, at some point, I think that Psychos is going to meet up with Drive Knight, or at least just the organization. Now, why would they meet up with her? Well, it's because of Orochi. Aside from their Egyptian counterparts, Drive Knight being Horus, Psychos being Isis, their common factor in the actual series itself is Orochi. Because Psychos created Orochi, of course, and Drive Knight now has Orochi cells in his possession, because it's implied that he's going to recreate Orochi, right? Now, it's possible that Drive Knight comes to Psychos because he needs help with recreating Orochi, because he wants to make like this big, all-powerful being that will assure him to take over the earth, right? Stop any other heroes that are in his way. And creating like this new, big, cyborg Orochi can assure that, but maybe he's having some difficulty with it. So he comes to the original creator. It's like, hey, can you help me finish making this Orochi? And then, whatever they talk about eventually gets to the point of where Saitama is in the discussion. Now you're saying like, well, how are they aware of Saitama really? Well, it's because I think Drive Knight has Saitama's data that was collected from Dr. Kuseno. Now, back in chapter 140 of the webcomic, Saitama goes to meet up with Dr. Kuseno along with Genos at like his lab. And eventually gets to the point of where Kuseno says to Saitama like, hey, would you allow me to take your precious data of your body, which is so strong despite being flesh and blood? And Saitama's a little hesitant about it, but Kuseno eventually convinces him by giving him some barbecue. And once Saitama gets into the machine that's going to collect his data, we see him like sleeping and there's drool coming from his mouth. I think this could be a parallel to the original story where it said, Ra was growing old, his eyes were dim, he had even began to drool, and Isis eventually collected the drool to make the serpent that poisons him. But after this sequence, we're not really sure if Kuseno like fully collected the data because we get really any insight into what had happened. Because conveniently, organization robots show up, kill Kuseno, attack Genos, but they're all eventually killed by Genos and Saitama. And we don't see them do anything, but in my opinion, I think that one way or another, they did steal this data from Kuseno, possibly off panel. Very likely off panel if we don't see it happen in a future chapter. And now that the organization has this data, that means that Drive Knight has this data as well. And he's going to obviously use this for his benefit, either to improve himself, his cyborg Orochi, or both. And I think he tells this to Psychos. But I think one of the major things here is that the data wasn't complete. Like when this robot showed up, we saw Saitama broke out of the chamber. So it's very likely that all of the data wasn't recorded. Like they only got, 70% of it or something. And Drive Knight's like, hey, I got all of this data from this super powerful guy. And in order to complete, this Orochi or just making myself super powerful, I'm going to need all of it. So I need your help with taking down this guy and getting the remaining data from him, or AKA his secret. And I think that this is where Ra's, secret name, getting his power, comes from. Now, I assume that Drive Knight is going to give Psychos, all of the tools that she needs to make this poison to infect Saitama. And it's going to be made from his own DNA, I assume. From from whatever data Kuseno collected from him, or maybe it's even from the drool, or just collecting his DNA in some way. And then Psychos is going to poison Saitama. Now, either it literally plays out like it does in the story, like she crafts a serpent and it strikes him, because obviously serpents are associated with Psychos, because like I said, she's freaking Isis. Now, maybe it's not exactly that. Maybe she does something else and she sneaks up on Saitama and poisons him. But to be honest, we've already seen this play out in the story, believe it or not, because one teased us with it in chapter 16. Like after Saitama is leaving the Hero Association, after he, has that little meeting with Snek follows him home, and as Saitama's like on that path, he pops out of the grass and attacks Saitama with like his serpent strike thing, and it's clearly represented here as like a snake about to bite him. But of course, Saitama just smacks him away because, he's Snek. But this is pretty much the story, the secret name of Ra, right? Like, this is what we went over. And if you watch my other videos in this series, you've already seen that I've showed you other examples of one doing this. And this is just another one. Pretty interesting, right? Again, maybe confirmation bias. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But I do think that this is one foreshadowing that this is eventually going to happen to Saitama. That he will be poisoned, just as Ra was by Isis. Now, after Saitama is poisoned, I assume that this is going to be the point of where he is quote-unquote defeated. And he will essentially be powerless for the first time in the story, or at least post-limiter removal. And this will bring us to the point of where Psychos demands to know Saitama's secret, such as Isis wanted to know Ra's secret name. Now, what is the secret that she's trying to get from Saitama? Not really sure. I don't think it's like literally his name, even though that is an interesting aspect of Saitama, because his name is Saitama, but that's all we know. We don't know what like his real full name is, or even if his name truly is Saitama. He never divulges any information about himself, to be honest. We don't really know anything about him, but in context of the series, it has something to do with his power. So it's possible that there's some kind of secret about him removing his limiter that he didn't divulge to the audience. And once he gives this information to Psychos, then she's able to give that to Drive Knight so that they can fully create Orochi or whatever. And another thing that makes me think that this is very likely going to happen is because the group that Saitama is currently with in the webcomic is the Hero Name Victims Association. Name Victim. Remember, Ra giving his secret name to Isis because he was a victim of her poisoning him. I think this is one winking to us that like, hey, it's all going to be connecting here. Now, in story, the Hero Name Victims Association is like a group of lower class heroes that were given just awful names by the Hero Association, and they're kind of protesting to get their names changed. Along with Saitama being called, Cape Baldy or Bald Cape or whatever. But I think this is also one, winking to the secret name of Ra story. Now, why is Saitama going to give his quote-unquote secret to Psychos? Because, in the original story with Ra, the pain got so bad, or he was eventually going to die or something, where he just told her. But I don't really think Saitama would do that. He's very selfless, very tough, mentally and physically, and like he just wouldn't so selfishly submit like that, right? It would be more so like if somebody else was in danger. So in this hypothetical sequence, Saitama would be powerless, right? And he wouldn't be able to help or defend anyone. So it's possible that Psychos is about to, I don't know, kill the Hero Names Victim Association or somebody else. And he's like, hey, all right, don't kill them. I'll tell you my secret. And I assume that's how it's going to happen. Now, also in the original story, after that happens, Isis cures Ra of the poison. And I don't think that's going to happen in One Punch Man. Like, why would Psychos heal Saitama afterwards? It just doesn't make sense. So I assume that this is when Fubuki comes in. Because, as we've talked about in other videos, Fubuki is based off of Sekhmet, the goddess of healing, also the daughter of Ra. And we've seen in the series, obviously, that Fubuki does have some serious healing power. She stopped Genos from exploding. She healed Tank Top Master. And I think that this is where more of her healing is going to come in, because she's going to cure Saitama of the poison that Psychos made with his DNA. And that will also bring them closer together because, the relation between Sekhmet and Ra is, father and daughter. But I think in this series, it's more so meant that Fubuki will be Saitama's love interest, but that's a story for another time. But once Psychos gets this secret from Saitama and gives it to Drive Knight, like I said, he's going to either use it to master his Orochi cyborg or also power himself, or both, because that also goes into the Egyptian story. Like, Isis got this power for Horus, for him to become the king of Egypt, or for Osiris to become the king of Egypt using Ra's power. And You know, as we've also talked about, Osiris is God in the One Punch Man story, but also Osiris is the husband of Isis, and Horus is their son. And I've also talked about this before, but Drive Knight is the son of God technically because he's one of his disciples. Like, that's how he became the Mad Cyborg, because at some point he accepted God's influence. Like, possibly when he was becoming a cyborg. And that's why he created the organization, as well as why Psychos created the Monster Association. Both of these, you know, main antagonist groups in One Punch Man are products of God. You know, Isis, Horus, Osiris. Organization, Monster Association, both their purpose is to essentially resurrect God one way or another, but also just to hand over humanity and Earth to him, right? And it's also a great contingency in case one of them fails, because as we saw, the Monster Association failed, so now the organization picks up the pieces, as they have been. And both of them are trying to create Orochi, right? Because we saw on the mural underneath the Monster Association that Orochi, or a worthy sacrifice equivalent to him, needs to be placed on the altar to resurrect God to the Earth. We saw that Psychos created Orochi, and we saw that Drive Knight collected Orochi's cells before he left the Monster Association war. Obviously, he intended to recreate him. So once Orochi is recreated and perfected using Saitama's power or DNA or whatever, he will, one way or another, instinctively, as it was also stated before, go down beneath the Monster Association and go to the altar and resurrect God. Like, that's the whole thing here. Both paths just lead to God's resurrection, just as it did with Osiris in the original story. So yeah, that's what I foresee happening. There is going to be a stretch of chapters where Saitama is ultimately powerless, and he unfortunately will be the direct result of why God is resurrected to the Earth, by them using him. But yeah, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments. Again, I'm not trying to convince you guys of anything. We're just having fun here talking. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But also, I want to thank everyone who watched all of my Egyptian mythology, Truth About One Punch Man videos. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked the video, please give it a like. And, you know, if you haven't already, please subscribe as well. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next one.